Confessions of a Movie Addict.
Hello, Looney. Hello, baby girl. Come here. We got Luna back in the studio. Yay! Hey, baby. She's jumping down to get away. Hi, and welcome back to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, we're looking at 1950s and 1960s horror movies. Two of them are science fiction, one of them ain't. But all three of them are movies that I first saw late night on television, back in the days when they had TV horror movie hosts. In Sydney, where I grew up, it was Ian Bannerman playing a guy called Deadly Ernest. Really cool, hip kind of horror movie host. Looked like Harry Palmer from the Ipcrest File, if Harry Palmer was a zombie. Very cool kind of gear look for 1960s. Did a nice job of it. So the kind of late 1950s, early 1960s cheap science fiction horror films that were syndicated to TV channels across the world from various distribution companies in the US. We saw them often because they were cheap for the TV channels to show. They could sell a little advertising, make a few bucks back. This was the days before commercial TV channels all went to infomercials all night, which is kind of sad, but on the other hand, we have streaming services now where we don't get ads in the middle of things, unless you're talking about Tubi and those other ones, but there's still that vibe about 1960s horror movies that really has a nice buzz about them now. At the time I first saw these movies, they were all scary as hell. Not so much now. We've got to the stage where a biopic about Marilyn Monroe is infinitely scarier than any horror movie that ever came out in the 1960s, including Psycho. So let's get started with 1959 and It, the Terror from Beyond Space. This one's got a good pedigree because the script was written by Jerome Bixby, who was a dyed-in-the-wool science fiction writer. He wrote novels, he wrote short stories, he wrote an episode of Star Trek. He also wrote the story upon which a fairly good, fairly recent science fiction movie was made. A very low-budget film called The Man from Earth. So Jerome Bixby knew what he was talking about when he was doing science fiction. And there is kind of a decent science basis for the monster he has in It. Now, we'll get the caveats out of the way first. It is a stupid name for a monster. It's not from beyond space, it's from Mars. So, leaving those aside, among the cast you've got Anne Doran, who was a good, solid character actress from the 40s, 50s, 60s. Dabbs Greer playing another one of the scientists. Now, Dabbs Greer was an actor who was known mostly for playing in westerns, but he also played the older version of the Tom Hanks character in The Green Mile back in 1999. So very long career, Dabbs Greer. Much better actor than a lot of the roles he was given. And in this one he gets to play a scientist in a bit different role for him. And he does a really nice job of it. It's interesting to see. There are some actors out there who did these cowboy roles and kind of played second sidekick kind of characters throughout most of their career. But when you see them in another role, they're intelligent, well-skilled actors. And it's a shame that their careers didn't go further. So the setup is this. It's the second spaceship to go to Mars. The first one has one survivor, a guy played by Marshall Thompson. Now, Marshall Thompson was a pretty boring leading man in a lot of films in the 60s. Ended up being fairly famous on television for playing a doctor in Daktari. Basically, he had the charisma of a house brick. And he is the sole survivor of the first mission. And of course, everybody assumes that he killed off everybody else on this mission because the spaceship was stuck on Mars. There was only food enough for everybody for a year, and the powers that be decided that he killed everybody else so he'd have enough food to last 9 years if necessary. He's almost the progenitor of the Matt Damon character in The Martian, except in The Martian, NASA didn't assume that the survivor killed off all the other characters. So the second ship lands and picks up Marshall Thompson's character, who is kind of not as shell-shocked and as whacked out as you'd expect him to be. And they're taking him back to Earth so he can be executed for killing everybody else. Kind of a stupid concept, but that's the way it's running. But unfortunately, a hatch was left open when they were loading gear on the second Mars mission, and a Martian monster climbed aboard. This rubber-suited beast is played by an actor called Ray Crash Corrigan, who'd been an actor and a stuntman for a very long time in the 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s. This was his last film, playing a rubber-suited monster. It's not a bad rubber suit, and they do the smart thing of using lighting very effectively to hide the fact that it's a rubber-suited monster. But there are a couple of scenes, you see, where, yeah, you can tell it's a guy in a suit a lot more than you can in some other bits. Now, the interesting thing about it, the Creature from Beyond Space, is it's really well paced and the suspense really works. They do some interesting different things to try to kill the monster. Pistols, for one thing, they have some automatics on board. And so they start shooting at it. Now, if I was in a spaceship, the last thing I'd want to do is shoot a 45 at anything. This spaceship is obviously built like a tank because bullets don't pierce its hull. They also have a whole bunch of grenades that they use and booby trap some hatches to try to kill the monster again. Concussion pressures on a spaceship when grenades go off, maybe not survival. They also have some gas grenades that one of the scientists has created, so they try to gas the monster with these homemade gas grenades, which again, you're in a closed ecosystem and a closed environment with air filtration and things like that. Poison gas is not the thing you're going to use in that kind of environment, so this spaceship must be incredibly over-engineered. But leaving that aside, the monster's quite powerful. It rips apart barriers between hull plates. It rips hatches apart like they're not there. It really is a kind of implacable monster in the best kind of way, and as the scientists try to find ways to defeat it, they learn more about it. They learn that it's probably a survivor from an ancient Martian civilization. It absorbs all moisture and oxygen-bearing molecules from human bodies when it attacks them. And so they know it's probably got really large lungs. It's very powerful. It can lie dormant for a long time. And it is hungry for both water and oxygen, because Mars doesn't have much of either of those things. So, you know, there's a scientific basis sort of for the monster. And it kind of works. I like the way the suspense is built up. The evocative lighting, which is used partly to hide the rubber-suited monster, is really effective. There's a lot of kind of lighting from below, and the lights are oblique. It builds an atmosphere wonderfully. The lighting designer for this film needed to get a bonus because it really works out well. They eventually figure out a way to get rid of it, which is very much the way that Sigourney Weaver got rid of the Queen Alien in Aliens. So there's probably a little bit of an homage to it, The Terror from Beyond Space. But yeah, it's a very effective little science fiction movie. It's not the first kind of rubber-suited monster attacking people in a closed environment. Of course, you've got the 1951 Howard Hawks version of The Thing. You've got Forbidden Planet, so it's in a well-trodden genre already in 1959. But on a relatively small budget, and with an interesting cast except for Marshall Thompson. Now, there's a couple of really weird things that play funny in this film from a 21st century viewpoint. There are a couple of crew members whose names are Bob and Gino. They've got a token Italian guy in there. And when Gino gets killed, Bob has a really strong reaction to Gino being captured and later killed by the alien, which is kind of could be a bromance, or it could be actually a relationship. There's a very close relationship between these two male characters, which, seen from a 21st century viewpoint, we can assume that they're gay. Maybe it wasn't designed that way earlier. There's a lot of legacy in this film from World War II, so those close buddy relationships that soldiers in war often had do play into the way this movie is put together. So it was made, 14 years after the end of World War II. And so that kind of camaraderie under pressure and under fire is still there. It probably played that way to a 1959 audience, to a 2022 audience. It plays a little bit like they were in a very close personal relationship, and that's fine. It kind of makes the movie a little bit more accessible. And the movie ends with a very ominous note about going back to Mars. And I kind of like the way it's phrased. There's a press conference where a message from the spaceship as it returns to Earth, is taking 4 months to get back, is read out by one of the powers that be. And it's an interesting little piece of business that only a real science fiction writer would have put into this kind of a movie.
A planet so cruel, so hostile, that man may find it necessary to bypass it in his endeavor to explore and understand the universe. Another name for Mars is death.
And for me, The Terror from Beyond Space really lands well as an honest science fiction movie with very, very little cringe factor. The fact that they've got a mixed crew aboard the spaceship is a big plus there as well. It's not your it doesn't turn into a service comedy the way a lot of other male-only space movies did at the time. The second of the three movies I got for you this time is from 1963, The Crawling Hand, which has got a kind of interesting cast. It's crazy low budget, but it kind of works in its own sweet way. You got a few stars in it that are kind of minor stars you might remember from TV and other things. You got Peter Breck, who you remember played one of the brothers in the Big Valley TV series back in the day, along with Lee Majors. You've got Kent Taylor, an actor from the 1930s to the 1960s, who was a kind of an interesting guy. He was one of the two inspirations for Clark Kent in Superman, because Clark Gable and Kent Taylor were the two inspirations for Clark Kent and Superman. So Kent Taylor was one of those guys with a pencil mustache and slick back hair, leading man type who aged into character roles later on. Didn't do crazily successful. But he was actually a Jewish guy from Ohio called Louis Weiss. And he was passing as a Gentile for most of his career. But in this one, he gets to play a Jewish scientist, which is kind of good, that he kind of embraced his heritage late in his career. You also get Alison Hayes, who turns up as one of the people working for ground control for the second mission to the moon. The first one was unsuccessful. They sent one guy up there. He died before they got back. They sent a second guy, and they're talking to the second guy while he's coming back, and he's running out of oxygen. And he's going kind of spooky crazy. He keeps talking to them after all the oxygen in his space capsule runs out. And he doesn't look well. So ground control, in the form of Kent Taylor and Peter Breck, decide they're going to blow up the spaceship before he gets home, because it's creepy as fuck the fact that he still comes home and can't breathe oxygen. So something is with him, some kind of alien life force is aboard that spaceship, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. So they blow up the spaceship, and then we cut to some teenagers on the coast of California, one of whom is played by, and I've got this written down, Seri Stefan, who was a Miss Iceland who became a starlet in Hollywood. And she has a kind of surly bad boy boyfriend who can't act. And they're in an ice cream parlour, and the jukebox is playing the Rivingtons' Bird is the Word.
Well, everybody's heard about the bird.
So it's a very groovy theme for the movie, which kind of makes it a little bit higher in value than it would be otherwise. So they're in there, and the surly boyfriend, who basically, the character is supposed to be a sympathetic character as the movie progresses, but he's an asshole to his girlfriend right at the start. So they go to the beach, as you do, and kind of go swimming together and have a bit of a pash and find the astronaut's arm on the beach. The girlfriend freaks out, so the boyfriend takes her home, and then goes back later on, grabs the arm and puts it in the back of a pantry in his landlady's apartment and hides it there. I think he thinks that he's going to kind of sell it to NASA later on, but not the best place to hide a human arm. So his landlady meets him, and he goes upstairs to his room and goes to sleep. And the arm comes to life and kills his landlady and tries to choke him to death. And he gets infected with the alien life force. Meanwhile, the local sheriff, played by Alan Hale Jr. before he was skipper on Gilligan's Island, starts investigating, and they find the arm and they take fingerprints from it, and the fingerprints end up alerting the people at NASA, or the equivalent of NASA. And so Peter Breck and Kent Taylor start investigating, and the movie goes on like that. And the alien infected teenage boy kills the guy running the ice cream parlor, and they get to play Rivington's Bird is a Word again. The special effects on the crawling arm are pretty good for their time. Partly prosthetic, partly a human arm with the rest of the human body off camera. But it kind of works. But there are a couple of weird aspects to it. But I think the direction is all over the place as far as directing the actors is concerned. At the start of the movie, you've got Kent Taylor and Peter Breck yelling at each other. They're angry as hell and they're pissed off and they're screaming at each other basically because all of this shit's going wrong with the rocket. Now, we know what people who run mission control for space programs are really like. They are calm under pressure. They don't rant, rave and throw paper cups around the room when something goes wrong. Their whole focus is on finding out what went wrong so that it doesn't happen in the future, and if possible to help the people who are up in space at the time. That's their focus. They can deal with their emotions later on. They can compartmentalize. Not in this movie. This movie has shoutiness in inappropriate places, and I think that there's a difference between intense acting and shoutiness, and this movie errs on the side of shoutiness, and it kind of put me off because of that. I think that even if it was shot on a low budget in a very short period of time, which it was, there are ways to convey stuff without kind of over-the-top acting. But leaving that aside, very much 1960s drive-in fodder. And I remember being scared as hell by the crawling hand when I saw it when I was a little kid, because that was before I was desensitized by all sorts of other movies to horror. And when you're a little kid and it's the 1960s, the very thought of an astronaut's body landing somewhere and the limbs crawling and attacking people was genuinely scary. This was during the Mercury program, and astronauts were going around the Earth, and there was the space race and things like that. So we were very geared to seeing astronauts as heroes. And the thought that one of them would, basically be dismembered and become a zombie arm was kind of creepy in that cultural zeitgeist. But yeah, well, it was fun revisiting it. I don't think I need to watch it again. But the crawling hand is of its time, and any movie that's got the Rivingtons singing Bird is a Word is a little bit better than a movie that doesn't have that. So as far as the acting is concerned in it, the most valuable player is Alan Hale Jr. He gives the sheriff a little bit of credibility through most of the scenes, though he does slip up a little bit on one or two of them. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. The Hypnotic Eye from 1960. Now this has got one of the best first minutes in any 1960s horror film. Now if you watch the film you know what I mean. It's got a really terrifying first minute that works really well, and it's got some interesting janky looking special effects in it, but it still puts things across before the titles come up on the screen, and it lasts exactly 1 minute. And I like it a lot. And I'm not going to spoil what it is. Watch the movie. Basically, the setup is this. There's been a series of self-mutilations by beautiful women in the city. And a detective called Kennedy, who's played by a very bad actor, is investigating. And he, along with his friend, who is the police psychologist, a guy called Phil, who may or may not, again, be gay, because he has a little froofy dog and a pinky ring. And when he's at home, he sits around wearing a kimono. They investigate it and try to find out what's happening to these women. And they each mutilate themselves in different ways. One of them slashes her own face with a razor. Another one puts her face into a metal electric fan. Another one drinks lye and burns out her larynx, which has to be removed. And yeah, basically there are a whole bunch of different horrible mutilations going on, 11 of them in a short period of time. Now, Detective Kennedy has a beautiful girlfriend, of course, and she has a beautiful friend too, played by Mary Anders. Mary Anders is quite a good actress. She was actually in The Time Travelers, the movie with that time loop in it from 1964. Again, she's a better actress than a lot of the roles that she got. So her and Marcia, the detective's girlfriend, and the detective go to a stage show to see a hypnotist called Desmond, played by an actor called Jacques Bergerac. Jacques Bergerac was married to Ginger Rogers, who was 17 years older than him for a period of time. And he was also married to Dorothy Malone. And he was a French guy who was kind of spotted by Ginger Rogers in Paris. And she got him a screen test in Hollywood and married him. So basically, he was a good-looking guy, but you know, not particularly gifted as an actor. So he does this hypnosis act on stage. Phil, the psychiatrist, is very wary about stage hypnotists compared to therapeutic hypnotists, and is not ashamed to say it. Desmond has a beautiful assistant on stage, Justine, played again by Alison Hayes, who does a really nice job of it. Her character is complex as hell, and there are some scenes where you can see almost a kind of lesbian attention she gives to female characters, which is kind of interesting. She's got a hidden agenda, of course, and I'm not going to spoil. Desmond hypnotises Dodie, played by Mary Anders, and that very night, Dodie decides to wash her face in concentrated sulfuric acid. She survives and is looked after by her friends, but that leads the cops to suspect that Desmond is doing something. And so Marcia, the girlfriend of the detective, is used as bait to find out exactly what Desmond is doing. Now, Desmond is creepy as hell. He hypnotises women on stage, and he whispers in their ears while they're on stage so that they will go out on a date with him. He takes them out, wines and dines them, takes them to beatnik cafes, which is where I'd go if I was in the 1960s, with some really groovy beat poetry in it. Then he takes them home, patches them a bit, before Justine stops him, because she's jealous of these women. Now, I'm not going to go further into spoilers. It's pretty easy to figure out what's going on. But the movie has a really nice suspense in it, and it's got some weird, kind of tangential actors in it. One of the doctors in the movie is played by a guy called Ferdinand de Mera, who was kind of like the guy in Catch Me If You Can, the character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me While You Can. This is the real-life progenitor of that character. And he's playing one of the doctors in the movie. He actually pretended to be all sorts of different occupations in the early 1950s. And they made a movie about him starring Tony Curtis. The real-life guy doesn't look a lot like Tony Curtis. So he's in the movie just for the publicity value of that. And they've got a couple of prominent beatniks in there, including the guy who sings the beat poetry, who is supposed to be the king of the beatniks. But there's a lot of sleazy creepiness in this movie. The fact that Desmond has to hypnotise women to go out with him, even though he's a good-looking Frenchman, is creepy as hell. And in a time when censorship was less, he might be seen as rapey as well. But yeah, he's incredibly icky and incredibly nasty. But then it raises the question, and I'm going slightly into spoilers with this one, is Justine hypnotising Desmond to hypnotise other people? That's the question I was looking for at the end of the movie, because she seems to have a control over him that doesn't seem quite right. Either that or he's submissive to her sexually, and that in itself leads to all sorts of implications that are a little bit more than the movie itself presents us with. And there are all sorts of interesting scenes where the cops interview the previous victim, and we see some of the stuff that's done to him. And the makeup effects in this movie are pretty good. They're not going to be medically accurate because censorship legislations wouldn't let them be, but they're enough to give you a kind of the shudders and the shivers, and to see the kind of damage these mad hypnotists are doing to people. And the Hypnotic Eye, it kind of has a short running time, and it's padded out a little bit towards the end, with Desmond hypnotising an entire audience to do stupid things. Jacques Bergerac's Desmond is a kind of freaky character. He's very bullying to his hypnotic subjects, whereas stage hypnotists I've seen have been more gentle and suggestive and kind of supportive. He's shouting at them and bullying them into doing what he wants, even though he does have hypnotic device, a hypnotic eye that he puts in his hand, which gives him the power to control people's minds. He really is shouting and bullying and harassing. And for a stage hypnotist, and I've seen one or two, he doesn't have that kind of charm that you need to persuade people to do what you want. He's really a kind of red flag character to anybody that's ever been around another human being. Maybe that's the weakness in Jacques Bergerac as an actor. Maybe it's the way they wanted him to play it. Maybe it's the short shooting time that all of these movies had that didn't let people develop characters. But one way or the other, I didn't like Desmond a lot. He kind of latched onto women and let his girlfriend mutilate them. He was a nasty pasty, but the movie does build suspense nicely. It gives us the horror of these mutilations and the kind of progenitor of a lot of body horror. And again, this may be influenced by things like Franju's Eyes Without a Face and the kind of facial mutilation storyline that movie has. But of the three, in spite of Jacques Bergerac, I think I like the Hypnotic Eye the best. I think that it plays a short running time really well. And even though I appreciate it, The Terror from Beyond Space, more as a science fiction movie, the Hypnotic Eye has that 1960s sweet spot of late night television horror movie. Much more than the other two movies have. So that's it for this time around. I thought I'd dive into a bit of nostalgia and kind of revisit those movies that I really enjoyed and was scared by back when I was a kid. Not scared by them now, but they're kind of fun, and I see a lot more into them than I saw at the time. And that's kind of fun too. Reevaluating movies from your childhood when you're older can be a kind of double-edged sword. But in this case, I was entertained by rewatching them, and they were a bit of fun, and they were worth revisiting because I hadn't seen them in such a long time, and I've moved on in so many ways, emotionally and as a human being, and growing up. It let me see the movies from a different viewpoint. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. And if you're subscribed too, you're going to see anything new that comes up, and you're going to be able to look at the playlists I have for various types of movies. You can also support the channel by donating a little bit every month at patreon.com/paleocinema. Got some unboxings to do next week, some really interesting stuff that Umbrella Entertainment is sending me that should arrive next week, and I will immediately unbox them and review the movies because there are some really groovy, deep cut cult films and mainstream movies that you might not have seen, but you might have seen but haven't seen for a very long time. Anyway, in the meantime, look after yourselves. Watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Dive back into some really old science fiction and horror films you saw when you were young and probably too young to watch them. And I'll catch you next time.